and editor Jane VanVooren Rogers, and I am so honored to be here today with Rica Keenum, author of Petals of Rain, A Mother's Memoir. Rica is a senior staff writer for a lifestyle magazine in Florida, and her essays have been featured in Huffington Post, Literary Mama, Scary Mommy, Elephant Journal, and more. So, Rica, welcome. Just so glad to have you here today.
Thank you. This is fun.
You were saying earlier this is your first live interview, is that right?
It is. Actually, I'm pretty used to being the interviewer because that's what I do full time.
Sure.
So it's a little awkward for me to be on the other side of the to speak, but fun. Yes.
So tell us about Petals of Rain. What is it about? What made you want to write this book?
Actually, there was initially no motivation for me to write this book. I didn't have it in my mind to do this book. I started out with a bunch of essays, and I knew that I wanted to compile them in some sort of way, and I wanted to create something, but I didn't really know what or where it would take me. So I
Mm.
contacted a book coach who was recommended to me by another author, and it ended up being really great. We've been working together ever since. I have written 2 books now with her, so with her guidance, I should say. And she's really helped me to be able to create something long form. I mean, creating an essay is much different than creating a book. And so, I probably would never have been able to do that without her, to be able to, continue and make something that makes sense and that's woven together in the book form. So I'm really happy to have been guided towards her and you know enlisted her to sort of help me. So it's been great.
Yeah, I relate to that, and I think we all need help for sure, in different ways with our writing. That even if you are a writer, sometimes if you're used to writing shorter pieces like magazine articles or essays, sometimes we don't feel as comfortable as equipped to write a book. I relate to that personally, and of course, it always helps, to have other eyes and objective opinions about your work that can help you to shape that and make it better. So, would you say that have you always been a writer?
I haven't always been a writer by profession. Obviously, I wasn't I wasn't actually in the business as a career until probably around 15 years ago ish. I started freelancing, and then
Mhm.
just led one thing led to another. And I guess I've sort of just been evolving this whole time into, what's my next passion, what's going to be my next project. And so now as a full-time writer, I am discovering book writing on the side. And so that will hopefully be something I will move into more fully, into different genres and things like that. Maybe fiction, who knows. But I've always loved writing, and I've always been a reader.
Absolutely. Well, I know that that's something that you mention in your book, Petals of Rain, where you talk about having gone to a therapist after I think your first child was born, and dealing with some of the issues and the fears that you were facing. And I found it very interesting that the therapist's advice was to get back to writing. How did that strike you at the time?
Well, it made perfect sense, because at the time, and since I was a teenager, I'd been writing poems. And so when she mentioned that, that was something, it was more along the lines of journaling and bringing that information back to her so that she could really see where I was emotionally and help me to process everything. But it turned out writing, was the very best tool to figure out what's going on inside, and things that you didn't even realize you were holding on to, when you get to the place where you're, just freely writing without, feeling like, okay, somebody's going to read this, or, this has to go somewhere. If you're just in front of the page and you've got your mind really into it, then it's more like a conversation that you're having with your inside, your emotions. You're having this conversation that is just wide open and free. So you discover different things that you wouldn't have. At least, that's how it is for me. And I know a lot of writers feel the same way, or musicians, any type of creative endeavor, really.
Absolutely. So would you say that for you, writing and healing have been closely tied together?
Absolutely. 100%. I think one of the things that someone said a long time ago, I don't even know where I got this information from, but when you're angry with somebody, write a letter to that person, not with the intent of ever giving it to them, but just as a way to vent. And so it's kind of the same thing. You're writing a letter, when you're journaling, you're writing a letter, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's just a way to process or get rid of some of those emotions.
So what were some of the personal experiences that you had and that you talk about in the book, as needing to heal from?
Well, there was some sexual abuse in my past, and things that I thought I really got over. But now, even during writing that book, I didn't realize until after I went to go write the second book and things had progressed in my life. I was starting a new chapter, but just really realizing how the relationships that you have are kind of shaped by other relationships. So the relationship I had with my mom shaped the relationship I had with my first husband, because I was in a vulnerable place and my self-esteem was low. And so, I found the good-looking guy who flattered me, and so that turned out to be a very bad decision. Not that I regret it, because I learned a lot and I got 2 children out of the deal, so it wasn't all that bad.
Right.
How the relationship was, can be positioned to take whatever someone gives you just because you think you deserve it, or it's the best you can get, and you just don't even know what a good relationship looks like sometimes, being that young. I mean, I was 18 when I got married, so didn't have a whole lot of life experience at that point.
Oh, right. Absolutely. Well, and I relate to those issues personally as well. I'm also a childhood sexual abuse survivor and also had an emotionally abusive first marriage.
Oh,
Um, so I relate to that a lot. And I didn't realize, until I started reading your book, the subject matter. And so I was really going like, oh my gosh, this is really relating heavily for me too. And I also, can just relate to having, 2 children that were, the blessing of that relationship. But those are challenges to, be overcome. And like you said, I think sometimes you don't realize until later in life the way that some of those traumas have affected you, and the way that, the initial childhood trauma, like you said, maybe set you up to choose someone as a young woman who seemed nice at the time, but who was not the best, fit for you. Is that
right.
something that you would say was that sort of a connection that you made, at once you started reflecting a bit more?
It absolutely was. And, even the fact that I had been divorced for many years when I wrote the book, I had never sat down and really thought about all those interactions that I had with my ex-husband, and, just the way that he treated me, the way that I in turn treated myself. And I just never had really thought about it in such a a deep, thoughtful way. And
Mhm.
so writing helped me to realize, all of the things that I let myself go through, And, they say you teach people how to treat you. And in a lot of cases, that's true. So I realized that I had I had been a part of that, all of that. I hadn't been perfect, but I allowed myself to be abused, verbally abused, emotionally abused for many years. So, just taking responsibility for that and trying to do better for myself in the future, and I think I'm in a good place right now. I feel like the older we get as women, and I've heard this from other women, but I feel this totally 100%, the smarter, the wiser, the less vulnerable we are.
I can see that. And, just glancing at your website, ricawrites.com, before I hopped on, and, seeing some of the other pieces that you've written, and some of them about basically like, yeah, I don't, give an F about like what people think of me anymore. I'm not going to read those lists. I was reading, that one essay that you wrote, and it was basically just like, I'm not going to read the lists that tell me, what to wear after age 30 or 40 and what I should and shouldn't be doing. And you're like, I've done that to myself my whole life. Like, I'm done. I'm done with that. And so I think that's something that a lot of, middle-aged women can relate to.
I agree. I agree.
So how did the idea, for this book begin to take shape? Like you had been an essay writer at that point, right?
Right.
And so how, like, kind of what was the moment where you started to think like, I really need to actually create a book from this?
Well, I had the essays and they weren't necessarily all even on the same topic. So when I brought those to the woman that I hired to be my book coach, she gave me some feedback on the essays that really stood out to her. And they were the ones that were about the traumas. And I realized what a gift that is, or that was, now looking back, because it helped me to go and unpack all of that stuff, all that emotional stuff, and really deal with it in a different way. But those were, to her, the most meaningful, the most engaging, probably the most that needed, the most important essays that had the best messages. So those were the ones we kind of pulled out and then worked on that in book form. And it took about 2 years, I would say. I'm not sure
Mhm.
exactly, of just weaving things together. I didn't write chapter by chapter. I kind of wrote scene by scene and then stitched it together in a way that sort of made sense. So,
Right. No, I really relate to that too, because, and I think a lot of writers probably have this, where it's like you've got computer files with different pieces of writing. You've got, papers with different pieces of writing, journals with different pieces of writing. And so sometimes it's almost like, bringing all of that together and then kind of seeing like, oh, I've actually been writing about this for a long time, or I have been writing about my life. Like that was something that kind of hit me, more recently, of, finding older pieces of writing and going, oh, I actually have been working on,
right,
this book all along, this memoir, but I just didn't realize that, these were some of the pieces. So I think that's really interesting to just hear that that's how that experience worked for you too, of going back to these smaller pieces and then having some guidance in stitching together the strongest pieces and the ones that, flowed, that you could make flow together.
right.
So I think that's really cool.
I think that, that's not everyone's process, but it certainly was my process. I feel like I do a lot of that every single day, being a regular writer, a journalist who interviews people and then takes that recording and transcribes it. Now it's like putting a puzzle together, because you're pulling the most important and essential pieces of conversation and you're putting them together in story form, which is the way that I created my memoir. I took the most important scenes and I put them together in story form. So that process wasn't difficult for me, but it was difficult for me to see that it could be done like that, because I had always
Mm.
envisioned, a book writer sitting down and going chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and that's not everyone's process.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. And I'm probably somewhat biased too as a fellow essayist and memoir writer. So that's probably somewhat why I relate more to your experience, maybe than, say, a fiction writer would, who maybe has that, grand master plan for their book. And, they're plotting things out and they're, figuring out all of those points up front. But I think when it's your own life and you're, again, kind of stitching those individual, almost like quilt pieces
Right.
together, that then you're making that work. So that's a great point. That's an important distinction, that just because we work that way, it doesn't mean all writers work that way. They all have their own, processes, of course. But so once this came out, Rica, did you hear from readers about your book and experiences? What did they share with you about that?
I think the most common feedback I got was that so many people had gone through similar experiences, whether it was the sexual traumas in early life, or it was, being young and having a relationship with somebody who was emotionally abusive or verbally abusive, or, just not nice. So, as women, when we're young, we don't have life experience. And if we don't have a strong family life, if we don't have, a really solid home life, then, like you said, it does set you up for a lot of bad decisions. So, we learn from those. And I think the best feedback I got was, I felt like, a reader saying, I felt like you were writing about me.
Mm, wow. And I'm sure that also has to feel validating to you personally for being willing to be so open and vulnerable about such difficult experiences in your life.
You know,
Did you feel that way?
I absolutely did. And it didn't hit me though that when I wrote everything, it was just really the experience. I was taking the journey, and I wasn't thinking about the final destination, publication out in the world. So on publication day, on release day, I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Because it just hit me then, all of this stuff is going to be out there. So yeah, it was a rude awakening.
So how did you work through that, Rika? That fear and that kind of, shock and awe moment of almost just like, oh my gosh, not only did I actually write this, but now it's out there and people are going to be reacting to it and reading this really personal stuff. How did you navigate that?
I think I just got comfortable with it, to a certain level. It's out there and it's done. It's kind of like when you say something and you're questioning later. Oh, did I say the right thing? Well, it's done. I've done it. I've said it. So it was kind of like that. But I don't think that I've ever gotten to the place where I'm just like, oh, who cares? There's a part of me that is fragile and feels like, no, bad review from someone, or that insecurity is still there a little bit. It's hanging on. So I don't know if it'll ever go away.
What kind of feedback did you get, if any, from any of the people who were, involved in, the people that you were writing about, I guess, in the book?
Sure.
Like,
Um,
did you get any feedback from any of those people?
my husband read the book, my current husband, and I was very surprised that he was so engaged and did read it, cover to cover in probably just a few sittings. That made me feel good that he took that interest, because he's not a reader, and certainly not someone who understands memoir. Not everyone does understand memoir, but I think in general, I got some good feedback. I had some coworkers that read it and were very supportive. But my family, as far as the people who had done things to me that weren't so great, and were some of the things, the traumas that I suffered and had to work through, they're not readers. They haven't read it. So it's not like I went, hey, you got to read this because you got to find out what you did to me. It was nothing like that. It wasn't a revenge piece or anything like that. And I certainly, if they're not interested in my life, which they're not, I wouldn't expect them to read the book.
Mm, that makes sense. Well, and I noticed too that you referred to your ex-husband just by a single letter, the letter
Yeah.
J. And I thought that that was, an interesting and helpful, technique too, of where you're able to share this information, but without attaching, an identity to it, and not even putting a pseudonym on it, but just putting a letter. And I mean, I thought that that was an interesting technique.
Yeah,
Did that
it was because I didn't want to. It wasn't about naming him and pointing the finger at him, because he's a, I don't know who he is now, but in the relationship that we had, he was good and he was bad. And so
Mhm.
I don't want to just say, this terrible guy, here he is. I
Right.
want to give him that privacy, and I don't wish any ill will on him. And so, I guess that was what made the most sense, is to just refer to him as a letter.
Well, I noticed that I had jotted down just a couple of quotes from your book. And when you said, I explained that Jay is a Jekyll and Hyde, that he alternately loves and hates me, and I can't crack his code. I really related to that on a personal level of having been in that kind of a relationship. And I think Jekyll and Hyde is a perfect description. How long into your marriage did it take before those tendencies started to emerge?
I would say, those things happened before we were even married. And the red flags were there, but, hindsight, you look back and you go, and I knew, but I didn't want to believe. And so, it just got worse. It wasn't going to get better with the stresses of marriage, and of being young, and having financial struggles, and then having children in the mix. Like, things just got worse. So the good moments were still good, but the bad moments were becoming more frequent and more explosive and more terrifying for me. So yeah, I it was always there. It just got worse. And I think the reason that was is because when I've learned now as an adult that when somebody is not happy with themselves, they can't be happy in a relationship. So that may have been the case with him. I don't really know. I don't want to analyze it, that deeply or personally, but I feel like that may have been the case.
Did you seek any support from family or friends during that time? And if so, what kind of response did you get?
I think I was more in protective mode. When you love someone, you want to protect their image. You don't want to badmouth them. And I at that point, I didn't really have a lot of girlfriends that I could go have wine and chat with.
Right.
So it was more just me and a few family members that I trusted. And I didn't go in depth about things that were happening at home, because number one, I wanted to protect my husband. And number two, I felt like whatever was happening to me was my fault.
Mm. I think that's common too for people in abusive relationships, that to an extent they do take on responsibility for people, and actions of those people that aren't your own actions, aren't your own beliefs, but it's like somehow you know, almost like when you're apologizing for the person, that if they, act out in anger around someone else. I mean, I can remember feeling like that, and that I was embarrassed. It wasn't even that I was embarrassed for him. I was embarrassed because I felt like, how could I be intimately involved with someone who's acting like this, and, who would talk to people this way, and like taking on that responsibility as though it were my own.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of, I kind of, as you're saying that, I relate it to the fact that when you're a parent and you've got a toddler that's misbehaving, not that my ex-husband was a toddler, but acted that way sometimes with the tantrums. But you
Right.
feel like I'm a bad parent when your child acts up. So in the same way, I must be a bad wife because my husband's misbehaving.
Or what could I be doing better, or what could I be bringing to this situation, or, oh, and I think you end up submerging a lot too. You end up submerging a lot of your own beliefs and feelings and things like that, just to try to keep the peace and not incite their anger about things.
Absolutely. I would say I was definitely a peacemaker, or, someone who attempted to make peace in all those situations.
So when was the point in your relationship that you knew you couldn't just keep going in this marriage, and with the emotional abuse going on? What was the breaking point for you?
I would say that I knew for a while before we actually got to the place where we ultimately divorced. But I still kept thinking, even after we divorced, that we could reconcile, we could fix things if he was in a place where he really wanted to. I thought, if he gets help, then maybe he can be, more stable with his emotions. But it just never got there. And probably the breaking point for me was right before I moved to Florida. So I packed up and went from Wisconsin to Florida. And that was my effort to get away and to be in a place where I couldn't say, this relationship is possible, I may go back. Being in Florida
Mm.
represented like this whole life for me. So it was like not going to be easy for me to get in a relationship with someone who wasn't there, who wasn't knocking on my door, who wasn't making frequent, visits or anything like that. It was my attempt to fully pull myself away.
That's interesting. So you almost felt the need to put, some geographical distance there so that you wouldn't be tempted to go back.
Yes. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Would you also say that a part of that, almost like the before you decided to divorce part was, um, wasn't there a discovery that you made, sort of right around that time that you were deciding to
Yes.
divorce?
Are you speaking of the infidelities?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
I even then it was kind of like we're broken, but it wasn't the breaking point for me because I still had a sort of a mindset that, well, I wasn't a good wife, so, maybe this is what men do. So I don't know. I was angry, I was hurt, but I did a
Mhm.
lot of searching within myself because I still had to get over the fact that it wasn't it wasn't me, it wasn't on me that had happened. People make choices to be unfaithful, and whether we provoke them in any way, it's ultimately the person who was unfaithful. It's their choice. And so, I was young, and again, I was in love, and I just didn't have the self-esteem to be able to discern right from wrong in that instance. So it took a while, definitely took a while.
Well, and I know that once you found out about his infidelity, that then it was suddenly like a, kind of that sixth sense rewind moment where you go, oh, so, the late nights at work or the time out saying, that he's watching sports and, things like that, that suddenly it was like everything clicked and, made sense. And then when you say that, the other person that he was involved with, seemed like, more of a sports person as well. And, as you said, the self-described meat and potatoes kind of gal. And it seemed like that really, made you question yourself too of, I think you said the phrase, men are from Mars. And so what did you say? So are their partners or so are their
So are their mistresses?
yes, something something like that. So at the time, did that really make you, again, sort of question yourself and make you feel like, well, so I guess I was just not fulfilling, like,
Yes.
this need for him or these interests that he had that I didn't share?
Yes, I think you do when something like that happens. You do question yourself. You question, what could I have done better? But also, who could I have been? Could I have made more of an effort to enjoy the things that he enjoyed? And when I went into it, I thought it's okay for people to have different interests, for husband and wife to enjoy different things. But I then questioned, did I let that gap widen too far? Did I let us get too far into our own interests, because I wasn't willing to sit down and watch a football game or go, watch a NASCAR race or whatever it was? Was it my fault that I let you know, that gap widen? And should I have been more accommodating? So yeah, I did question that a lot.
Mm. So after you decided to move to Florida, where did your journey take you from there?
There was a period of depression after that. You get away, and initially you have all these tasks. You're unpacking, you're getting your kids into new schools, you're sort of, you know, getting accustomed to your surroundings. And when everything is settled, then you have to deal with yourself. You have to deal with the reasons that you moved and where will I go from here emotionally, and as a single mom now. So there was that period where I was depressed because I didn't know. And I think I made the comment that all of the ghosts of the past were coming up,
Mm.
and that really was the case. I mean, you're questioning all of the marital issues, and you're questioning yourself, and then you have that fear of, okay, what now? And you don't trust yourself. I made all these poor decisions, and I let that relationship fall apart. I had a part in that, so I let that relationship fall apart. I let myself be treated very poorly. Am I equipped to be a single mom? Am I equipped to ever find love again? Am I equipped to support my kids? So there was a low point where I had no self confidence, and I really had to try and build myself back up so that I could be a woman, so I could be a single mom.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of soul searching and a lot of looking for support and things like that.
That makes sense, and I can understand where it's almost like you kinda have to have that, like you said, kind of depression and reflection and all those pieces that come together as part of, your healing. So that makes sense for sure. So what would you say, if someone asked you like what's sort of the main message of Petals of Rain, what is something that, you would like for readers to understand, or people who are watching this show today and thinking about, picking up the book, like what would you say are some of the main messages or the main things that you would like for people to take away?
Good question.
Mhm.
I would say the best message that, or the most prominent message, is the one that I learned. The past is over, but you have to take accountability for the past as well, because if you realize who you were and what mistakes you made and how people and relationships affected you can understand how you got to where you are today
Mm,
better. You can see that's why I'm the woman I am, and you can start to build from there. And so I think just not being afraid to journey back and put the puzzle of yourself and your life together so that you can move forward and do a better job at decision making, people picking the people who are in your life, the people you allow to either love you or hurt you, and just reflection, self reflection, and just reflecting on the experiences you had, and trying to realize how they shaped you for better or worse.
well, and I know in the book that you write about, that your mother's husband was your abuser as a child. And how did that affect, your relationship with your mother?
It it affected it a lot, and it's to the extent that I didn't even realize until after the book was written. I still didn't understand a lot of the feelings that I had for her until I got married again, and that's what the second book is about. So I don't want to give too much of it away,
Yeah.
because I wasn't intending to write that second book, but like I did with the first one, it just kind of came out and unfolded the way that it did. But
Mm,
my relationship to her was very shallow. um, she was unwilling to talk about things and deal with things. And so I always knew that opening that conversation with her wasn't possible. So it's kind of like you've got somebody who you feel betrayed you, but you still love that person. That person
mhm.
was my mom, and I in my heart, I felt betrayed by her.
Yeah.
So you can't really have a deep level of, you can't have a deep conversation, a deep emotional relationship with somebody who is avoiding this huge thing that you have to talk about, that you feel like you need some kind of closure. And so, yeah, very strained relationship, very strained. And ultimately, I did have to make the decision that I couldn't have the relationship and be healthy and be whole anymore,
Mm.
unfortunately.
Well, but, unfortunately, maybe for the relationship, but probably fortunately for you, and like you said, and for your
Yes.
own sanity and your own survival. And that piece of the story doesn't mirror, my own story. However, I can relate to the aspect of, I was victimized by a neighbor, and his wife, I believe, did know what was going on. And so I relate to sort of that aspect of, again, the wife who is protecting, the husband and allowing these things to go on. And I believe she allowed it with her own children as well. So,
Ugh. It's really unfortunate how often that happens too. When I started talking to a counselor about some of those things and researching, looking for women who had gone through the same thing, I realized how common that is.
mm,
And the more I thought about it, the more I also understood that I had sort of done not anything to that extent, but I had protected my husband as well, in all of the ways that I allowed him to be abusive. So for a woman to protect her husband is sort of normal, but not to that extent, obviously. Um,
Right.
so I could understand a little bit of it, but it's such a tragedy when it goes that far.
So how do you feel about your sons potentially reading this memoir someday? And did that give you pause, I guess, in creating this?
Well, I did get permission from my sons. Um, Not that I was going to, I don't know if I would say, well, I'm not going to write anything about my life because they don't want that exposure. But I just wanted to be sensitive to their feelings and their privacy. And so I did ask, especially because my younger son had a lot of issues with ADHD and with his depression and, all of the mental hospital and all of those incidents that happened. Um,
Mm.
so I did want to ask him, are those things that you don't want out in the world? Maybe I can soften things a bit or gloss over things a bit. But he was completely open to having anything be said because, I think he's mature enough now to know that you don't have to be ashamed of the things that you go through. Mental health is
Right.
becoming more of a topic that we can freely talk about. So, people should
Mhm.
know if you've had struggles and you're in a good place now because it is encouraging.
Right. Absolutely. Um, I guess I wondered from the aspect too, as far as like their relationship with, their dad, your ex-husband. And I guess I just wondered if that gave you any pause or concern, or, I'm not sure what their relationship is, with their dad, at this time. But
My older son is still in contact with him, and I believe they have a good relationship. I don't necessarily know too much about that, but
Mhm.
I do know that they are in contact and they are on good terms. My younger son has ceased contact with him and hasn't contacted him for a while. So,
Mm. And it wasn't, because I was trying to recall from your book, did they witness a lot of things, or were they pretty young at the time that they didn't necessarily know what was going on?
you know, I didn't realize they had witnessed as much as they did. I think kids are resilient, but you also can underestimate them and in what they can understand and what they can feel, not necessarily see or hear a verbal fight, but to feel the tension around it and to understand, things are fragile. So, that was the case for both of them, but there were times that they did see the physical, violence. Not that I'm not saying my ex-husband abused me physically, but there were times where he would throw me up against a wall or something, that's physical abuse, but that's as far as it would go. um
Mhm.
just the anger, just the eruptions, and they were witness to some of that.
Mm. That's so they that's interesting, just that they had pieces of that, and I completely agree and understand what you're saying about that even if they're not necessarily witnessing, the arguments or witnessing certain things, I think that kids pick up on far more tension, like you said, tension and the atmosphere and almost like a nonverbal understanding of what's going on. So that's a valid point too. How
Yeah.
how old are your sons now?
24 and 22. I have a hard time remembering how old I am. So,
I relate to that too. But that's interesting. I think, do you have any sense too that maybe because your sons are a bit older that maybe you didn't, worry quite as much about, about putting this book out there or how they would receive it because they're a bit further, along in their own development?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're old enough to understand, and I wanted them to have my version of the story because I think, everybody in the household has their own version of the story, and to be able to hear, maybe why I did some of the things I did, and we made some of the decisions individually as parents, so they could see my story, my side of it.
And for your younger son who's decided, not to be in contact with his dad, you know, um, was that just something where he just found that it was too negative or too painful for him?
I think he and I are kind of on the same page about letting people into your life who are not good for you. And my ex husband was always closer to my first son, our first
Mm,
son. And my second son, we had different parenting ideas. And now my second son, the younger son, had a lot of problems from age 4 and up, the ADHD, the emotional outbursts, and things like that. And my ex husband looked at that as it's bad behavior. And there was
mm.
not a lot of compassion there. And so, um, I think my son grew up with the feeling that his dad thought he was a bad kid, thought he was,
Mm.
a troublemaker and things like that. And he did verbalize that. I mean, he did say that a lot. I don't know whether to this day he understands what led my son to behave the way he did because he had issues. It wasn't just I'm going to be a bad kid and I'm going to break things or I'm going to, get the school mad at me. So I don't know what that looks like right now for him, but I certainly hope that he looks back and understands that there were mental health issues going on. So yes, my son does realize that he was misunderstood and
Mm.
he doesn't feel the need to be around or have any contact with him.
That's interesting because, for multiple reasons, but I think one of the reasons that, you know, he- that your ex-husband, his dad also, you know, was somewhat, I think, emotionally abusive and verbally abusive toward him as well, even just in painting him as a troublemaker versus trying to understand, what his actual challenges were. So that's really interesting that it's almost like, now that he's older and he has a better understanding of that, that it's like, yeah, I don't need that in my life. And that sometimes the positive aspects of having a relationship with a parent don't necessarily outweigh, the negatives of some of those comments or some of those mindsets, that
Right.
person tried to convey.
I'm really proud of him for that. I mean, I feel like he doesn't have hatred towards him. It's more like a healthy understanding of what's good in your life, and so I'm proud of him for that.
Yeah, and creating a protective boundary around that for himself
Exactly.
as well. So we're talking about Petals of Rain, which is, your first memoir that came out. And so then you mentioned that you have a second book that's completed and in the works. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that? I know you were alluding to that earlier with more the story about your mom and things like that.
Well, okay, so the second book will be released in the spring of 23. It's sitting with the publisher right now, and it's kind of a continuation of where Petals of Rain ended, and so it picks up there and goes back into scenarios and scenes and relationship aspects again, and the focus though on this is more of my relationship with my mom, because
Mm,
there were some things that happened after Petals of Rain that were very traumatic for me and caused
mm,
me to then want to address the emotions and the relationship. And so the book is more themed towards mothers and daughters, and
mm,
um, it's similar, but it's also different.
mm. Is there a title that you can share on that one? Or is that still in the works?
um, Tentatively, the title is She Walks in Beauty,
Oh,
and
nice.
a mother daughter, and it's actually after a poem that I had memorized as a child, and
I recognize
it
that.
it relates to oh, do you? Okay. Yeah.
The
So yeah, there's
she
a connect.
walks in beauty like the night. Who is that? Remind me who it
Yeah.
is. I'm trying to remember who that is.
You know, I can't even remember. I think um
It's going out of my
you
head right
know, I
now.
don't
Um, Lord Byron. Lord Byron,
Lord
right?
Byron. There
Yeah.
you beat yes, it's Lord Byron. And I do remember the poem, and the way that I thought about it is not the way that I think about it now, because I read it as maybe a preteen teenager and remembered it. But you know, it's changed. It's the meaning of it has evolved for me.
Can you talk a little bit about that and why you chose that as your tentative title?
So I chose it because I feel like women as mothers, they sort of have, you know, this standard that they feel like they have to be, you know, everything to everyone. And She Walks in Beauty is kind of like the way that I saw it when I read it as a teenager, not knowing, you know, where my life would take me. The way that I saw it was, you know, women are perfect. The perfect woman looks like this, and the perfect woman has all these attributes, and then later on in life you realize there is no perfect woman. And so the poem relates to,
Absolutely.
because I'm examining my relationship with my mother, and I feel like in many ways I did hold her to a standard that she couldn't meet. So there's that,
Mm,
be realizing, you know, what could never be for her and for me, and, you know, in our relationship. And also just accepting that, you know, sometimes beauty isn't perfect, and women are not certainly perfect and will never be that, you know, standard. That will never be what the world wants us to be, that everything's
mhm.
everyone.
How interesting. I love the fact that you felt after this memoir that you had more to say and so much more to say that it spilled into another memoir for you. I think that's great, and it sounds really intriguing.
Thank you.
So maybe
And
maybe
I,
we can have you back on in early 2023.
yeah, fantastic.
That would be great. So what else would you like to share about either, Petals of Rain or your journey as a writer or um, publishing or anything else?
Uh, I'm not really sure. I mean, I really definitely hope that I will have some more essays out there in the world. I've attempted to write some fiction, and it's, as we were talking about before, how, you know, as a memoirist, you're sitting down and writing scenes, and you're not necessarily writing, you know, chapter one through chapter 30 in a one, you know, journey, one linear journey. So that's kind of my struggle with fiction. So I'm hoping to be able to overcome that and do some fiction, but definitely I'll have more essays out in the world, and I really hope to have, you know, more topics and more meet more writers, and just enjoy the journey of being a writer, learning and starting new projects. I certainly am glad to have met you and to be
Yeah.
talking to you. So
Well, I'm glad to have met you too, and I'm excited about your books and would just like to help, support you and your work. I think it's wonderful. And I definitely relate to your essays and your memoir, this memoir topic, especially some of the things that you cover. So I'm definitely glad that we connected too. And it's just so interesting sometimes how you can find other writers that you have such deep things in common with that you had no idea were even out there. So
Right, right.
do
You
you do
never
you
know
have
what you're going through, you know?
yeah, and or recovering from, or what
Right.
have you. But do you have any suggestions for other aspiring memoir writers like myself, out there who are trying to write about difficult life experiences and trying to figure out how can I share this with people in a meaningful way and also not sort of get lost in my own emotions? Do you have any
I think,
suggestions?
yeah, I think that a lot of people worry about, are they saying too much, or um is are people going to judge or see a part of me that isn't so beautiful or perfect. But I think definitely start by just going into it without fear, and think along the lines of, I'm writing this for me, and maybe I'm the only one who will ever see this. And then just decide, I guess, later on whether it's something that you're comfortable exposing. And it's got to be something that is the goal, I guess, is to help you grow, but it's also got to be something that maybe can um, inspire other people, and it's just something you're very comfortable showing. So I don't know, I get a lot of questions about that. How do you write a memoir and stuff like that? But I guess it's different for everyone. And if you go into it with the mindset, I'm writing this just for me, and see where it goes.
Mm. I think that's great advice because I think so many times as writers, we can get so hung up in either that end product or worrying about what people are going to think about it. And if you get too focused on that and caught in it, then it really hampers, I think, that creative process. So it's almost like a mental trick, maybe, of almost having to kind of mentally trick yourself. This is just for me. No one else is going to ever see it. And then
Right.
you can always dial it back, or like you said, make certain things more subtle, or change names, or what have you. But at least then if you've captured your own experience, you've been able to free that inner the inner critic and the inner worrier that is just so scared to even create.
Right. Freedom. And I think thing that really helped too was working with a book coach, as opposed to, and I think having a group of writers that you bounce your ideas off, and you share and critique each other's work, that's good. But if it's so deeply personal, it's probably better, in my mind and in my experience, to work with a professional, because then that person is trained to not give opinions that don't improve your writing. They're not telling you, oh, I felt this way. They're telling you what you need to hear, and they're doing it on a professional level, and they know what to look for and all of that stuff. So you're probably better off working with somebody who has mentored writers through memoir and really knows the ropes. So and someone you're not afraid to share things with.
That sounds like a great suggestion. It sounds like the book coach that you worked with was really helpful to you. And I know that, as you said, there are many of those folks out there and who can help you sort of walk step by step through the process and let you know which parts of the story are working and which aren't,
Mhm.
and how you can make it stronger. So that's a great
Yeah.
suggestion.
Also, I think sometimes people are also not, we need an accountability partner. We need somebody to say, oh, keep writing, keep writing, keep going. So that's also a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So how can people, best keep in touch with you and see what kind of essays you're writing?
Certainly, I would say on my website, but also I have the women's group on Facebook that I've started recently, and it's a creative corner, and it's for anybody who is creative, and I believe we all are. So it's, all the women are welcome. We can learn from each other, inspire each other, and just share each other's work. I certainly welcome authors to share what they're writing. I don't have a problem with self promos. Some groups have rules and things, and it's necessary, but I found that everybody has band group. So it's a plus. Looking out for each other, and they're still sharing their own stuff, but moderately.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your website is ricawrites.com. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So you can go and read a little bit more about Rica and read some of her essays on her site, ricawrites.com. And I would also highly encourage you to go grab Petals of Rain, a mother's memoir. It is just a beautiful book, and I think you really have such a poetic way about your writing, the way that you describe things and the way that you describe your experiences. And it was really a pleasure to read it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
And I know right now too, it happens to be $4.99 for the Kindle version. So definitely, I highly recommend going and picking that up. Is there anything else, Rika, that you'd like to add for today?
No, I want to say thank you to you, and I genuinely want to, keep in touch and learn about your projects and your memoir and all of that. So please stay in
Oh,
touch.
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I would love that. And I appreciate that generous offer. And I so appreciate you coming on Author Talks today and just talking a bit more about your memoir with us. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everybody go get Petals of Rain. Next week, I will be back to talk with writer Ellen Mulligan about her book Blaze. So we'll look
Ooh.
forward to that. And thanks everybody for being here and watching. Have